Hello, this is Fred at the Gate with today's devotional. And I have a question for you. Why aren't you on God's plan? In 1 Kings, the 17th chapter, verses 1 through 24, read that as you have an opportunity. But it deals with the prophet Elijah and God telling him to go to the river, to hang out there, and that he would have ravens bring him meat and bread, and he'll have water at the brook. He does that because he's obedient to God. And then it says, a time came when the brook dried up. And at that point, God told him, now go to a widow in Zarephath, and she will be able to provide for you. Now, what we need to understand is that doesn't make any sense, because back in that day, widows had to rely on the kindness of the church and strangers for their own sustenance. And here God is saying to his prophet, go to this widow, and she's going to provide for you. Well, what we need to understand is you can rely on God's promise. When God told him to hang out at the brook and that the ravens would feed him and he could be able to drink at the brook, it was just as God says. But this is the kicker. Don't just listen to what God has said. You have to continue to listen to what God is saying. Because as we grow, God will change situations and circumstances and then send us somewhere else. And so just as you can rely on the promise at the brook, you can rely on his promise with the widow. So he goes and finds the widow who is all ready but to eat her last bit of meal. She got a little bit of meal, a little bit of oil to make a cake for her and her son. She said they're going to eat it and die. But the prophet says, well, first make something for me, then for yourselves. Well, she's obedient to do that, and God provides for his prophet and provides for the faithful widow. So there is a premise. When you're on God's plan, he makes a promise, but then there's the premise. The premise is what we have to do. God will say, if you do this, I will do that. God's always going to do his part, so you and I have to be prepared to do our part. There's God's promise, there's always a premise, but that's how we make progress. Once the prophet was faithful and went to the widow in Zarephath, and once the widow was faithful and obeyed the word of the prophet, God blessed her, because there was a drought in the land, and God blessed her that her barrel of meal never ran out and her jug of oil never ran dry for the entire time of the famine. So why aren't you on God's plan?